Excellent. Okay, so if we can start from you telling me basically what you were up to before 1939 or before the outbreak of the war, what you were doing.
Well, I was, in retail shops in my father's business, and we carried on. We had men's, boys, and the girls' shop as well at that time, and generally watching points and schoolwear and running the business, and until the war started. The war started, as you know, in 1939. And so I continued to look after the shops. My brothers were called up earlier than myself, and in 1941 I was conscripted as well and called up to fight for my country.
Right. So how was one conscripted? You get a letter in the post?
Yes, we had a letter through saying you are conscripted and you should join the army, and go to a place I went to was Didcot for training.
Right.
And so that's what I had to do. I went there for training, and then I carried on from there. The training consists of what to do with rifles and guns, and learn about ammunition, and I was put into the Ordnance Corps. Now, the Ordnance Corps is the organisation which supplies all the arms and ammunition and everything to the fighting forces, and that was what I was put into. In fact, I was put into not what I thought it would be, clothing, because I worked with clothing before I joined up, but I had to go into wireless spare parts, which I had to learn about, which was a bit stupid, but there you go, that's how the army sometimes work. And so that was my first experience of the army, and having to bash the roads with the orders, sergeant major, and learn about the army generally.
Okay. So where were you living in England before you?
Well,
were you living in London?
I was living in London, yes.
Okay. And did you want to go and go into the army, or was it something that you really would rather have not?
They just tell you, in those days, if you wanted to go into a certain, say, the Air Force or the Navy, you would volunteer before your call-up papers. But I didn't particularly want to join any particular part of the armed services, and so I waited for my call-up papers.
Okay. And were your parents?
I was 18 at that time.
Yeah. As you were 18, were your parents worried about you going off?
Well, naturally. I mean, they had 3 sons, 2 brothers and myself, and they were naturally worried about the war and what would happen to us, and especially when we all eventually went abroad.
Right. So you started off as a private.
That's right.
And you went to Didcot for training.
That's it.
So once they trained you, can you tell me a bit about when they told you that you'd be going off abroad and where you eventually ended up?
Yes, well, after training, I got what they call a posting to say I was going to India. So that was it. So I got everything ready and had to go and go down to the coast, Southampton, and with quite a few other people. There were quite a few men that went on this draft, as it's called, and we got onto the Athlone Castle, a nice, very big boat to take us to India. And the journey I didn't like. I wasn't very good on the sea, and sick as a dog, especially around the Bay of Biscay. That's very turbulent waters. So I was in the toilet some of the time, reaching up and getting rid of the food which they gave us, and eventually coming round the Bay of Biscay, because we had to go into South Africa, and where we docked in Cape Town as part of the journey to get to India, more supplies and deliveries to India, which we had on board. And so from Cape Town, we had a few days in Cape Town. It was very nice, and we went sightseeing for a few days and saw Table Mountain and a few interesting sights. Got back onto the ship, and at that time it was very dicey, because a lot of ships were being sunk, so you wondered whether your ship was going to go down with the submarines, the German submarines and their torpedoes. And one or two ships did go down on the route to India. Luckily it wasn't ours. So when we arrived in India, and I was posted to a place called Jabalpur in the central provinces of India. Because at that only one place, it wasn't India in fact. They split up the country. And so about any questions from
no, just if you can tell me what you arrived, and did you know what to expect?
No, it was quite didn't think it would be hot when I arrived, but so India is hot, and wearing uniform as well, wearing caps, and anyway, so they promoted me to sergeant. Administration. We were attached to the Indian Army, and so I had so many men under me to look after them, get them to do various duties that they had to perform. And so that was my experience. It was very hot. Hadn't been abroad before then, to any country, so it was quite an experience to be there. And of course, as I said before, our duty being in the Ordnance Corps, that's RAOC, that's what it was called, and we had to supply all the fighting forces with everything they needed, and that was part of my job, and organise and make sure that they were supplied. I mean, I wasn't the only one, but in the organisation to help to get those stores to the fighting forces. And that's what I was doing in India.
So what would you do day to day, actual kind of intricacies of being there? What kind of things would you do from morning to evening?
Well, there was a lot of paperwork, and I had to make sure that things went to the correct places, and make sure they went onto the correct trains or transports, and so it was part of my work there. And then they decided to make me a warrant officer, which is a step above a sergeant, a warrant officer, and which I had a title called subconductor, which is a strange thing to be called, but I was made a subconductor. Then eventually I had more responsible duties, so they made me a conductor, which is a warrant officer first class. Now, the conductor term is a strange term, but many years ago in India, when they had important letters to go from one place to the other, and that's going back hundreds of years, shall we say, they called these people they could trust, conductors. And so that term came into the Indian Army, and likewise the British Army, for warrant officers, they were put into subconductors or conductor classes. So that's what happened in India.
Right.
And I mean, I was surprised to see maybe you might be interested, the poverty that I saw in India. I mean, at that time there must have been about, I think, 800 million people, and I mean, the different castes and religions example, I was amazed to see the castle, the Untouchables. You can't believe it, but I mean, these people were only there to clean out the latrines, and that was their dirty work. And to see other faiths, this was very striking in what I saw. All the other faiths, they went to extreme measures to keep away from the shadow of the persons concerned.
Okay, so moving on, can you tell me a bit about the who you were supplying the ammunition to, whereabouts the fighting was taking place?
Previously, I was just finishing the story about the Untouchables, that the other castes used to go and have a bath if the shadow of the Untouchable went on to them.
Right.
Things like that was unbelievable,
yeah.
When I was there. And little points of things that happened. I mean, one can wake up in the morning, and a couple of times found a snake in my boots, nestling in there. You had to be careful, there were a lot of snakes about. And also the one interesting thing that happened that we had a joke about, I can always remember, was they used to transport on bullock carts with 2 big bullocks, delivering, through the night to different areas, in India. And a few of us, just for a laugh, we went to one of the bullock carts that came along the road, and the drivers, they'd sleep on it, and the bullocks know where to go on the road, so we turned it round. So we were laughing when he would wake up, and say in the early hours of the morning, or when he got to his destination, he'd be nearly back to where he started. It was just a bit of fun that we did as an interesting story. What other things that happened there? I mean, it's like when the monsoons came, we experienced the monsoon, and it was wonderful because prior to the monsoon and the heavy rains, it was so hot that we just took all our clothes off and dashed out into the rain and laughed and joked, which was a fun thing to do. And it was lovely to have a beautiful shower with cold water. And so that was something that we like to do. Things like that, which is maybe of interest to you. As far as the stores and ammunition, I mean, they were sent to northern India, and some items put onto ships and sent to the Middle East, because that's where most of the fighting went on in the Middle East. I didn't do any fighting. Luckily I was in a reasonably safe area and a safe job to do. But I mean, a lot of my friends were sent to the war zones, and 1 or 2 did get killed, I learned later on. It could have been me, but luckily...
Were they friends from home or friends you met in India?
Friends I met, no, I didn't meet anyone from home. It's just friends you went along out there to India, and you got friendly, and your company in the platoon, and so these things did happen, so I was lucky in that respect. I mean, as far as my parents were concerned, I mean, it was a worry. We all went overseas. My 2 brothers were in the Middle East, and they were also, strangely enough, in the Ordnance Corps. They put them, because we were in retail, except my eldest brother, although he was a solicitor, he was still in the same corps. And luckily they came out of the war okay. It's just luckily that as far as our parents are concerned, we all came back.
So how many years were you in India altogether?
I was in India for 2.5 years.
And when did you hear you were coming home? What was that like?
Well, that was wonderful news, and we were told we were going back because the war had finished in 1945, and then we came back on the Mauritania. That was an interesting trip back. It's a very well-known big boat, the Mauritania, in those days. Maybe you haven't heard about it. And we came through the Suez Canal, and it's the first time a big boat of that size managed to get through the Suez Canal with just a few inches to spare. We had to go very slowly, and it was quite an interesting journey back. Came back, I was in charge of about 50 men of all different ranks, different corps, and I had to pay them and look after them on the way back. That was a responsibility, but anyway, we all came back home safely, and that was my war experiences.
That's good. And from there, how did you meet your wife?
Oh well, then from then on, of course, we went out. I had friends. We went out on evenings like you do yourself.
How old were you?
Well, I was 29, and eventually I found Diana at a dance. A very nice tall girl. I used to like tall girls. No doubt you like tall girls as well.
Yeah.
And got both mutual attraction, and from then on we got together and eventually married.
Excellent.
What's that?
That was my phone. That was my phone. Sorry.
Yeah, so
that's great.
Yeah.
Are there any other interesting parts of when you were in India you can think of just before we wrap it up? If there aren't, that's fine. Just
different things. Well, I had to get used to the food out there. I mean, curry and rice,
right.
Mainly. And well, cooking was fairly good. Where I was lucky. The food was quite good. And supplies were okay. As for anything else, I remember writing home to my parents and saying, I'd just been lying in bed and been shaved
right.
by one of the bearers. We called them bearers, the people who did the odd jobs. And he was a barber. He used to come round. So I'm lying in bed with a cutthroat razor and shaving. I'm really horrified to hear that, but I thought it was quite funny, just lying in bed and being shaved, which was just one of the things that did occur, and things like that, which
what did you do for girls there, or entertainment? There's always in war, nothing like that.
Nothing much. They used to get, say, people come round to entertain you, occasionally, but not often. A few films you could go and see. But as for girls, well, it was pretty well frowned upon not to associate with the Indian girls too much. And anyway, in those days, one was very scared to associate with girls because, diseases were quite rampant and didn't want to catch anything. I know things today are just as bad as far as catching things with young people and with sex, but that definitely was out as far as most were concerned. And so that we didn't have much entertainment, we just worked and that's it. And did our duty, which we performed.
Okay, and finally, when you were out there, or any time during the war before it was over, did you know what was going on in the camps of Eastern Europe and places like that, to the Jewish people in concentration camps?
No, not at all. No, we didn't know anything about that side of it. That was not at all. there were a few Jewish Indians, which I didn't come across, but I know there are quite a few. Even today, I think there are certain areas which have Jewish Indians. And as far as the Jewish side of it, it didn't seem to worry me being Jewish. It didn't sort of come out particularly that I was Jewish. And so that was my experience.
Okay, well, thank you very much for talking about it.
Okay.
Turn off the camera then.
Okay, fine.
It's recording now. I'll sit here. Okay, so if you can tell me where you were born and a bit about the place you lived.
Well, of course, I can't remember when I was born. But I've been told I was born in Queen Charlotte's Hospital in Hammersmith.
All right. Okay.
On the 20th of August 1930. My parents at the time were living in, I think, Finsbury Park. I'm not sure. I really don't know. And when I was 9 months old, we went to live in Brussels.
Why?
That's a very good question, but I really don't know the answer to. Perhaps my father decided that things might be better in Brussels. I really don't know. I really don't have much recollection of being very, very young. I think my first recollection was when Auntie Margot, who was 18, and I'm 11 years younger than she is, so I was about 7, she got engaged. And I remember her to-be father-in-law asking me whether I'd like a pram or a doll. And I told him I'd like a scooter. She bought me a scooter.
Cool.
When the engagement was broken off, I didn't have to return my scooter. I remember odd occasions, like going to my grandparents for Seder night. And as I was not exactly the youngest, because my cousin Sue is 4 years old younger than me, and her brother is 8 years younger. But I was the one that understood what was going on, and I used to have to go to the door of the flat and open the door to let Mashiach in, or whoever, I can't remember. Who? Messiah? No, not the Messiah.
Elijah.
Elijah. And they lived in a flat, and you opened the front door, and it was pitch black staircase, absolutely pitch black, and I was terrified, wondering who was suddenly going to appear. Of course, they didn't explain to me that nobody would.
Where was this, in England?
No, in Brussels.
So you all moved to Brussels?
Yeah. Well, my grandparents lived in Brussels.
Okay, they lived in Brussels. So
yeah.
Did you?
This is my mother's parents.
Did your parents speak French?
My parents spoke Russian because they were born in Russia, both of them. My father actually, I think, was born in a part that was Poland, and the Russians took over. So I don't really remember.
Do you know any of the names of the places that either of your parents?
Where he came from, no. But my mother was born in Yekaterinoslav. I think it's got a new name.
Okay.
I don't know. Her father was a miller. People used to come and buy flour from him. Going back a little bit, what she did tell me was that when she went to school, she wasn't allowed in the train. She used to have to stand on the steps and hold on to the bars outside, because they knew she was Jewish, and they wouldn't allow her in the train. And in the winter, those bars got very frozen, very cold, and sometimes her gloves used to, freeze, holding on to that. And then they went off to America. My grandfather, I think Uncle Sam went first. He got all the family over to America. My mother went to school in America.
From Brussels
so she
to
spoke
America.
Russian, she spoke English, and she spoke French.
And what jobs did your parents do in Brussels? Do you know?
My mother and father, when they lived here in England, I think they ran a delicatessen in Hampstead Village. And I think the deli, there's still a delicatessen there.
In Hampstead High Street?
Hampstead Village.
Right, okay.
Yeah. You know when you go down the hill?
I didn't know that.
There's a deli there on the right-hand side, and I think Margaret told me that's the one they used to run years ago. My father also travelled. His father was a glove manufacturer. And my father used to travel to England to sell gloves. They used to make gloves for dentists. He used to travel to England to sell. That's why I think he always had a hankering for living in England. My brother was born here. John was born here. Margot was born in Belgium. So where was I? Yes, so apart from going to my grandparents, going to Antwerp for an engagement party when Uncle Willie got engaged to Auntie Helene. Do you remember Willie and Helen?
No.
I remember going on the train to Antwerp to the engagement party. I remember going to school. I remember once I must have forgotten my lunch, and my father came to the gates. When I was in the playground, I remember seeing him at the gates. He passed me my lunch. But actually, otherwise I don't remember very much.
So how old were you when
we came back to England?
Yeah.
9.
So that's probably...
It was May 1940. I do remember being bombed in Brussels. Of course, I didn't know there were bombs, but I remember waking up and hearing these terrific bangings, like building works, you know, bricks falling or something. And I didn't know what it was. And then we found out afterwards that the Germans were bombing Brussels. And my cousin Boris, who lived in England, he was Auntie Beattie and Uncle Sam's eldest child. Boris was working in London for, I'm not sure who, but anyway, he knew there was going to be trouble in Brussels. And he was on the phone constantly for 2 days till he got through to my father and said, drop whatever you're doing, get the family together and come to England, because there's going to be trouble. Now the family consisted of us, like my father, my mother, Auntie Margot, Uncle John, myself. My father's mother, my mother's parents, Uncle Willie, Auntie Helen, Auntie Lily, Uncle Michelle and their 2 children, and Michelle's mother. I think that's it. Anyway, he got us all together. My father got everybody together and said, Boris phoned and said, you know, we have to leave. Some of them said, oh no, Auntie Olga, Uncle Alex, and Annie and her parents. Now, Annie and her parents and Olga and Alex decided to go to France, not to come to England. The rest of us decided to come to England, but my father's mother, I really don't know how old she was. She always looked very old to me. She didn't want to come. She said she was in Brussels during the First World War, and no way was she prepared to leave her home. It would be the same as the First World War. So what happened, my father decided to send us with the rest of the family, and he would try and persuade her that she should come to England. We went to, I think it was Ostend, where Auntie Margot went to the British consulate and said, I have a brother and a sister who are both British subjects, and we want to get to England. We have family in England, we want to get to England. So he said to her, well, I can't do anything today, but if you come tomorrow between certain times and look for me, I'll get you on the boat. Well, she explained that there were a lot of us, my grandparents, well, it was, you know, about 10, 11 of us. We spent the night in a boarding house, and again we were bombed. I remember running down the stairs to the shelter, to the cellars. And next day we went to the station, and Margot was busy looking for this Englishman who was going to get us on the boat. And as it happened, the Germans came over and started machine gunning everybody. And everybody lay flat on the ground. And behind me, I remember seeing Belgian soldiers with rifles hiding behind us. And because everybody was lying flat, Margot saw the man she was looking for. So in spite of being machine gunned, she got up, jumped over all the people that were in her way to get to this man. And he said to her, the third boat along, because they were moored sort of, how can I explain, like this, one behind the other. I think the first two were going to France, the third one was hopefully coming to England. I don't know where the others were going. Anyway, the third boat. So when the German planes went, she got everybody together, and my cousin Lucien, that's Lily's son, had chicken pox. She was carrying him, and she put a veil over his face so nobody should see that he was, you know, spotty, because they might not have let him get on the boat. And she and Lucien and my grandmother got on the wrong boat. I think they went one too far. And you know we have a family whistle. I can't whistle, but you know the family whistle. And Uncle Willie whistled, and they turned round to look, and he waved to them to come back, to come on the boat that we were on. It was a Scottish boat, and funnily enough, when Margot and Jeff were up in the Outer Hebrides a few years ago, before Jeff died, they came across this boat. I can't remember what it was called. She might remember. And one of the men on the boat still that time was one of the sailors that brought us over.
So which grandparents are you you're talking about on your mother's side?
My mother's side.
So on your father's side, your grandmother refused to leave, and your grandfather
and my father waited to try and persuade her, and we got the last boat.
What about your grandfather? Was he passed away at that point?
Yeah.
Right.
I never knew him, so he must have died a long time ago. I do remember hearing, and I really don't know how we heard, that my father went to, I'm not sure whether it was Antwerp or somewhere else, when he realised that my grandmother really wasn't budging. And he tried to, you know, find a boat to come over. But they were only evacuating the English soldiers that happened to be there, or the English, the army, and they wouldn't take him. I don't know if you remember, well, you don't remember, but if you ever learnt in history, that a lot of little boats from England went over to pick people up. They wouldn't take him, so he had to go back home. We came to England, and my first recollection was seeing a policeman, and they were so tall. I mean, in those days I think you had to be 6 foot to be a policeman, and then they wore these, you know, these high helmets, looked like a giant to a 9-year-old. And I remember being told that if ever you want to know anything, if you want to know the time, or if you've lost your way, that's the person to ask. From there, I think Uncle Sam came to fetch us, because he and Auntie Beattie lived in England. That's my mother's eldest brother, Uncle Sam. And during the war, we lived, where did we live? We lived, Uncle Sam at one time bought a house in Hadnam, it's in Buckinghamshire, and nearly all of us left London and went to live in this house. He bought quite a large house in Hadnam to get away from the bombing, so we lived with them. Where else did we live? Can't remember. I can't remember. I know that when I was 14, no, I was younger, 14, 1944, the war was nearly over. I went to Southport. I think I was at school at Southport. I went to school in Hadnam, and because I really didn't know any English, I had to go to the infants class to learn to speak English. And once I learned to speak English, then they put me in the class of my age group. So we must have lived in Hadnam quite a good few years. I really can't remember how long. And then I think when the bombing stopped in London, we must have come back to London. Now Barbara was in the army, that's our Uncle Sam's daughter was in the army. Boris went into the army as well. It's Boris's son who's coming over in a couple of weeks' time. Boris got killed on D-Day +5 or 6. He was a dispatch rider. His motorcycle went into a wall. Got killed. What else? Auntie Margot got married in 1941. Uncle John went into the Navy during the war. Went into the Navy, Fleet Air Arm.
The American Navy?
English.
Oh, so he didn't go to America straight away?
No. Didn't go to America.
Oh, he didn't go to...
No, he lived here. I went to school, but he didn't go to school because he's 7 years older than I am, so he must have been about 16, 17.
This is the karate teacher that...
Sorry?
Or was that your father?
John.
Who's the person that taught me karate?
John.
Okay, but I thought he went to America.
Only recently.
Oh, okay, he didn't go...
He didn't go to
initially.
America. No, he was in the Fleet Air Arm during the war. And met Carol. Got married. I can't remember which year he got married. It's a terrible memory.
Doesn't matter. So, when you were in England and you're 14, by that time, 13, 14 odd, I guess you can understand what's going on. So, what were your thoughts? If your father was in Europe and your grandmother, what did you know what was going on? Because Papa Joe says he didn't know.
We got a couple of letters from him through the Red Cross. In fact, I think I've got them upstairs somewhere. I can't remember what they were dated, 43, 44, something like that. To say he was fine, he was well, everything was okay, and hoped we were okay. And we didn't hear what happened to him until after the war. Actually, no, I'm wrong. I think the war in Europe finished. John was still in the Fleet Air Arm, and he was due to go out, Margaret would remember, I think he was due to go out to the Pacific or somewhere. And Margot wanted him to go to Brussels to see if he can find out any news. And trust my sister, she went up to the Admiralty, saw some big guy there, and demanded that my brother be given compassionate leave to go to Brussels, which they gave him. So he missed his trip to the Far East, which was just as well because we were still fighting in Japan. And he went to Brussels and discovered that my father had been living somewhere or other, I don't really know where, and they'd come in the middle of the night and taken him away. And that's all he was able to find out. We don't know, we have a feeling that he must have been in some sort of business for the first few years of the war, because we have photos sent from there where he looked very smart, very smartly dressed, and very with it, but we couldn't find out any details of what he was doing. But in Brussels, Annie showed us a book of all the names of the people who were taken away by the Germans, where they were sent, what train they were in, the number of the carriage they were in. Absolutely, I mean, the Germans were very methodical everything was absolutely written down. So I do have upstairs some information about that, but off the top of my head I can't remember. I think it was 1943 it was taken.
Okay, so what happened when you were adolescent then in England?
I went to school.
Mm.
I left school very young. How old was I when I left school? 16, I think. I don't think I was ever very good. I didn't particularly like the teachers. My mother and I lived, when Jeff, Margot's husband, was in the Air Force, we lived with Margot and Jeff, but he was awake most of the time. I went to school in Golders Green, in Child's Hill. It used to be called Child's Hill Primary School, secondary school, I can't even remember, primary school I think. There's a block of flats there now. It's, do you know that part of Finchley Road where Auntie Joyce lives? There used to be a cinema called the Orpheum, something like that. And behind there was a school. That's where I went to school when we lived in Sneath Avenue in Golders Green. What year was that? This was after the war. It was after the war. I should have kept a diary. Anyway, I went to school there and it's rather funny, but I have a very old photo that was taken in the playground, and one of the boys I discovered afterwards was a second or third cousin of Papa Joe's.
Mm. So how did you meet Papa Joe? I've heard how he says he met you.
Oh, I met Papa Joe first of all when I was 17. A friend of mine, Sheila, said to me, would you like to come to a dance? The Hatikva Society that she belonged to were having a dance Saturday or the Sunday, I can't now remember. Would I like to come? And I said, yeah, of course, I'll come. And that's why I met Papa Joe first time. And I thought he was so much older. Well, he is 9 years older than I am. He was out of the army. He took me to, we met at the Trocadero, I remember that. Trocadero used to be a restaurant, Trocadero. It was a bit smarter than Trocadero at the moment.
Mm.
And we made a date to go to a dancing club in Regent Street where they taught you to dance. I remember an evening we spent there. And he used to love going to news theatres. We were forever going to news theatres. Even after we got married on a Wednesday afternoon when he wasn't working, we used to go to town to the news theatres. We went out a few times and then suddenly nothing, all peace and quiet, didn't hear from him. Oh, he told me he was going on holiday to Switzerland. That's right, he was going with his friend Arthur to Switzerland on holiday. Must have been about 47, 48, beginning of 48. And I never heard from him again. And I used to laugh and say, oh, he's fallen down a mountain, you know. And then 2 years later, that's funny. No, I got it back to front. No, I'm wrong. 1947. That's right, 1947. I went with Margot and Jeff to the Edgware synagogue, not the Reform, the Orthodox synagogue, who, before they built their proper synagogue, they were in a sort of a hut, which is now a nursery school in Mowbray Road. And they were holding a dance, and the three of us went, that's right. And Margot saw two young men walk in, and this is her story. They looked round the hall at everybody as if they were examining cattle. And she didn't say anything to me, but she said to Jeff, just watch that guy over there. and he's making a beeline for my Didi, and that was Papa Joe. That's where I met him. The dance at with Margot and Jeff. And then he asked me out, and we went out to the dancing club and Chocodera and so on. And then 2 years later, when I hadn't heard from him for 2 years, that's when Sheila, my friend, asked me to come to the Hatikva Society. They were holding a dance. Would I come? And I was dancing with somebody, and who should be dancing with another girl? It was Papa Joe.
Clever.
And he just looked at me and said, "Hello, how are you?" As if he'd seen me the week before. That sounds typical, doesn't it?
Yes.
And he said, I'm on the committee, and I just have to do a turn at the something or other. I can't remember now what. But he said, "I'll come over and talk to you later." And that was it. Mm. And then we got engaged in January 1950. So I first met him in 47, and I met him again in 49. Must have been towards the end of 49. We got engaged January 1950.
Mm-hmm.
And married in August 1950.
And then my mother was born when?
53, January
Really?
53.
Good stuff. Okay. Well, thank you for telling me all about that.
I can't think. I'm sure I've left out lots of years in between, but I just can't remember. It's funny. How far back can you remember?
I think all the way back to I'm about 6. I probably remember 6 or 7.
6 or 7, somewhere like that.
Mm. That's
Yeah,
most of them.
I was 7 when Auntie Margot got engaged for the first time.
Mm.
Vague recollections. I mean, silly things. There was a shop in Brussels where we used to go and buy bread pudding. Absolutely delicious. There was another time, I think we were coming from my grandparents. We must have been there. Maybe it was Seder night, or maybe it was just a Friday night dinner. And we didn't have a car. And I remember walking and holding my mother's muff. You know what a muff is? It's a fur round thing you put your hands in to keep your hands warm, and there's a string round your, well, not a string, but you know, like a ribbon round your neck to hold it. And I dropped it and lost it. I don't know how old I was. Otherwise, I don't remember very much the first few years. I remember John and a friend walking in the streets in Brussels where when the Germans came over and bombed, and they were just out in the open, just looking up the aeroplanes.
Mm.
Crazy.
Have you been back to Brussels where you used to live?
Yes. Yes, we went with Margot and Jeff. I'll tell you exactly when Annie's husband died. We had bought our Mazda. I think he died in June. We just bought the Mazda, it was a month old, and we took Margot and Jeff to Brussels to the funeral. So about 12 years ago. Mazda must be about 12 years old. And we spent a few days there, and we drove round to different places that Margot could remember.
Mm.
I think one address where we lived was Rue d'Église. We went and looked at that. But a lot of the streets have been renamed, and she couldn't remember exactly what was what. But and then one year, when Papa Joe and I went on holiday to Italy or somewhere by car, and coming back we went through Brussels to see the family, because Annie and her parents lived there. Which, by the way, when they escaped to France, they then returned, when France was occupied, they then returned to Brussels, because they had a house there, so they returned. My aunt and uncle returned to Brussels. And when we saw her, she said that she'd been out shopping one day, and coming home to go into the house, a neighbour was in the street, and she said to her, "Don't go home, the Gestapo are there, walk straight past." She'd apparently dyed her hair blonde, and she didn't look typically Jewish. And that's how she escaped being taken, deported. And my cousin Annie went to Switzerland with a friend, and they wouldn't let them in at the border. They wanted to send them back, and she was determined not to go back. The friend she was with, a young man, was sent back. She took an overdose of aspirin, or the equivalent of aspirin. Became very ill, and they took her into hospital, where the nuns looked after her. And she stayed in Switzerland.
Until the war was over?
A friend who went back didn't survive. So she was lucky as well.
So did you speak to your brother very much?
Who?
John.
Do I speak to him? Babe? Oh, you wanted to know whether he was in the American Army? No, he married Carol, and they had 2 children, Mandy. I don't know if you ever met Mandy. His daughter Mandy and Keith. And then they got divorced. Mandy went to America. I think she entered America illegally. And then she married an American. So she's still living there. She's on her 3rd husband at the moment. John went to visit her. How old is Ben? Ben is 17. John must have gone to visit her about 17 years ago. And while visiting Mandy, he met his present wife, Joan, who's obviously American. And he came back, and then she came to visit him here. And eventually they got married, and they lived here for a while. And then she heard that England was going to be submerged by water. We were all going to drown. And therefore she persuaded John to go to her home in America. So that's why now he's in America. And he has 2 more sons. Why I say 17 years ago, because I remember their wedding, Ben was in a pushchair.
Did you speak to him very much?
Not very often. He's a very bad correspondent, a very bad communicator. I spoke to him recently because he's thinking of coming over. He says he wants to see the family. Well, how old is he now? He's 78. And Argo said, well, why don't you come over? We'll send you a ticket to come, because I don't think he can really afford to pay the fare. He's not working at the moment. Life in America must be quite expensive. He's going to come in May, but May we're going to be away. So Margaret wrote to him and said, come at the end of June, because June we're going to be away. So whether he's going to come or not, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks,